Hi everyone, Brenda Gustin here, and we're on Metabolism Part 2, and we're going to start talking about carbohydrate catabolism. Now, I'm going to do this topic in a little bit different way than I've done the other topics this semester. I'm going to make videos on this, but I'm not going to necessarily follow the chapter. What I have found is catabolism and metabolism in general is a topic that's really important, and there's a lot of ways and a lot of reasons why people should be able to relate to it. But when you're just learning it in A&P or micro or general biology or wherever you start learning about it, there's so many details that are presented that people lose the big picture. So I've had a lot of practice over the years of presenting this topic, and it's actually one of my favorite topics to present because I think a lot of students think they won't be able to understand it. And I pride myself with helping students understand this and making it meaningful. As a result, I'm going to use a little bit of your textbook, but I'm going to also go to some slides that I made that are in an order that makes sense to me in the way that I like to explain this. What I recommend is using all of these videos for this lecture and for this topic. And then if you want to go back through your own textbook and review that, and you'll realize that I did discuss most of these things, and I think you'll have a little bit of better appreciation for the point that they're trying to make. So go back through this, but I'm going to kind of go away from this and then come back a little bit later. So one of the first things I want to say is when we learn about metabolism, when you're just starting to learn about metabolism, there's hundreds of chemical reactions that are going on in cells and all different areas of metabolism you could study. But we almost always start students by learning about carbohydrate catabolism. That's using carbohydrates to break them down and release energy to drive anabolism. And the reason we do this is for two reasons. One is carbohydrate catabolism is very central to metabolism, and a lot of the other chemical reactions in metabolism somehow connect into this, the chemical reactions of carbohydrate catabolism. The other one is just because it gives you a good appreciation for the complexity of metabolism and some real life examples of conditions that you know that relate to failures in carbohydrate catabolism. So one of the things I try to do, so I could be giving this lecture in A&P or I could be giving it in microbiology, but here I am giving this lecture in microbiology. So in addition to understanding how humans catabolize carbohydrates, I want you to have an appreciation for some of the variations that are done by microorganisms. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about is consistent with what you learned in A&P about humans, but we're going to learn a little bit more about anaerobic respiration and fermentation, which is done in mostly microorganisms. So to move forward, excuse me, the first thing I want you to do is here I have draw a concept map illustrating the ways microorganisms perform carbohydrate catabolism. And so here we are, carbohydrate catabolism can be done aerobically or anaerobically in the presence of oxygen or in the absence of oxygen. And when carbohydrates are catabolized, when they're broken down to release energy, aerobically in the presence of oxygen, we call that cellular respiration. And you're familiar with this. You've learned about this in biology or A&P somewhere, where you learned about glycolysis and the Krebs and the electron transport, and you might have no idea what all that was talking about. And that's going to be my job to make sure you understand that. But the other thing is we have some situations in which carbohydrates can be catabolized anaerobically. And again, these are mostly done in microorganisms. And there's a process called anaerobic respiration and another one called fermentation. So we're going to talk about all three of these in this discussion. I like this picture right here because what it does is it shows you here's a compost pile, and you can see steam coming out of it on a cool day. And so what it's showing you is the microbes in here are breaking down the organic matter, and they're going to generate ATP. Remember, energy is trapped in catabolism by the molecules of by creating molecules of ATP. In the case when you're making ATP, no cell is completely 100% efficient, so they lose some of that energy in the form of heat. So bacteria are actually generating heat here. The first thing, and so your first objective there was name the 3 ways that cells catabolize carbohydrates and whether it's aerobic or anaerobic. And so you can use that little concept map we just did. The next objective is write the overall equation for aerobic cellular respiration. And here we go. When I'm talking about aerobic cellular respiration, I'm talking about something that you're very familiar with. Here's the overall equation. And you can write it in formulas, you can write it in words. I would make sure you recognize both ways. You don't have to balance all the numbers or anything. But here we are. When we're talking about aerobic cellular respiration, this is what you learned about in A&P already, or biology, or whatever course you got this in. We have glucose. And hopefully you'll remember that glucose is a 6-carbon compound, C6H12O6. So you have glucose plus oxygen, and we get carbon dioxide, water, and ATP. Remember, our whole point of doing catabolism is to take larger molecules, break them down into smaller molecules, and generate ATP. So it can be used to build cells. It can be used in anabolism. Now you know about this because glucose is just one of the important examples of food that we eat. So even if you ate toast or ate some bread for a meal, that bread is got a lot of starch in it, and starch is a big long chain of glucose. So eventually, you know, a lot of your food that you eat will get converted into glucose, that blood glucose that you have. We're breathing in oxygen, and we breathe that oxygen in order to be able to metabolize that glucose. This arrow right here corresponds to this whole pathway. That arrow is aerobic cellular respiration, where we're starting with glucose and we're putting in oxygen, and I didn't show you where that is yet. And we're getting out carbon dioxide, and you know that we exhale carbon dioxide. There's some right there coming out. There's some more coming out. We get rid of water, and I'll show you where that is in here. But the point of aerobic cellular respiration is to get energy from that glucose. And you guys know that. When you're eating your food to get energy. Why do we have to breathe? Because combustion needs oxygen. We're essentially doing combustion in our cells, that we're using oxygen to break down the glucose, generating carbon dioxide, water, and ATP. So that's the overall equation for aerobic cellular respiration. Recognize it, be able to write it in words, or be able to write it in formulas, whatever works for you. So what I have done is, in your lecture study guide, I put a page that says aerobic cellular respiration, and I put this picture in there. Now, here we are, this respiration right there, that's the aerobic cellular respiration. That's the metabolic pathway. Over here is fermentation. We're not going to worry about fermentation until the end, okay? So let's ignore that right now and just follow this pathway. So you guys, what we want to figure out is, how is glucose metabolized so it can generate ATP, CO2, and ultimately a lot of ATP, and use oxygen. How's all that done? And it's done in 3 steps, or using 3 major pathways. No, I had a problem there. Okay, first one you have is glycolysis. Glycolysis means glycolysis, breaking down, like glyco sugar. Lysis means to break, so breaking down sugar. And so here's your glucose that was in your original formula. Here's a whole bunch of enzymes, and each one of those arrows represents an enzyme that's going to take that 6-carbon glucose and break it ultimately into 2 pyruvic acid molecules. Now think about that. If a glucose is 6 carbons, and I break it into 2 identical molecules, How many carbons are in each one of those pyruvic acids? Must be 3, right? 2 times 3 is 6, because I didn't lose any carbon dioxide here. So in glycolysis, we say glucose is broken down into 2 pyruvic acids in a metabolic pathway. We generate ATP. Oh, that's our whole point of doing aerobic cellular respiration. We want to generate ATP. The other thing we generate is NADH. And you might remember from the previous lecture that NADH is one of these energy carrying molecules. So NADH is related to ATP. And so some of the energy released in this process is trapped as ATP, and some of the energy is trapped as NADH. Once we get through glycolysis, we have something called the Krebs cycle. Now, pyruvic acid is converted to this other stuff called acetyl-CoA. I don't care if you remember that name, but what you do want to remember is in that process, you lose some carbon dioxide. So if I have a 3-carbon pyruvic acid and you lose 1 carbon dioxide, there's one of your carbons just got lost. Now you have a 2-carbon compound. And the reason why I'm making a big deal out of that is I want you to notice that these carbon dioxides that we exhale, or bacteria, it diffuses out of the bacterial cells, they are the exact same carbon as was in the food that you ate. So here's the food that this cell consumed. So that toast that you had or that bread that you ate, the exact same carbons in that bread or whatever meal you ate are now floating around the room as you metabolize them, as you metabolize that food. So there's some of your products, some of your carbon dioxide. That 2-carbon molecule gets shuttled through the Krebs cycle, and there's a bunch more enzymes. And those enzymes are going to ultimately take that molecule and convert it into CO2. And when we add up all these CO2s for 1 glucose, you're going to end up with 6 carbon dioxides. That should make sense. I'm going to back up a little bit because here's our glucose, C6H12O6, and here's our 6 carbons. So all the carbons in glucose are now in carbon dioxide and we're exhaling them. Okay, look at what happens at the end of the Krebs cycle. We don't have any more molecules to break down. We've got them, all the carbons been broken down into single carbon compounds. But we got some ATP. That's good because that's the whole point of doing aerobic cellular respiration. And we also have some other energy carrying molecules, FADH2 and NADH. So all of our energy from that glucose molecule is tied up in these. Remember that ATP is the currency for a cell. If I want to build new cell parts, I have to use ATP for anabolism. But there's a lot of energy left in NADH and FADH. That energy the energy in those have to be converted into ATP if you want to use them in anabolism to build new molecules. So we have a third step in aerobic cellular respiration. It's called the electron transport chain. And the goal of the electron transport chain is to take the energy from NADH and FADH and convert it into ATP. I'm going to stop there and continue in the next video.